A win is a win, and the Texans did that in prime time on Sunday Night Football. We're going to talk about that and more on this edition of The Bullpen.
To throw the punch into him. He floats one wide open, and there he goes. Touchdown for a Texan touchdown.
Hello and welcome to this edition of The Bullpen. I am James Roy, and as always, with me is Tom Chavarria. Tom, it's late. The Texans just won. Oh, immediate first impressions. What are you thinking about this game just from what you saw?
I'm thinking they have work to do. This literally is not the team that we think they can be. I think there's a lot of things to clean up. There's offensive line issues. There's penalties that, we're going to get into. There's just a lot there that this could have been so much better. But like you said, a win is a win. Well stated. I think it's important to note that a win, any way you can get it, is good.
Yeah, I mean, everyone talks about ugly win, pretty win, and I think obviously you, based off of your score prediction for this week, and even me, even myself, probably expected a more of what is commonly referred to as a pretty win, and that's just not what we got. I saw a tweet from Landry Locker that kind of I felt like made sense about it, and the gist of it was that grinding out a win at this point in the season with the team that the Texans have means that they have a good team, and they're still just putting it together. So I mean, I'm not mad. Hard to be mad about a win, but on this Victory Monday, it felt like maybe we might be having more conversations about what the Texans can improve on instead of talking about how they, held the Bears under their thumb for 60 minutes straight and just absolutely destroyed them. So without further ado, we'll roll into it just real quickly before we do that. This is a Texans podcast called The Bullpen. And if you found it, you probably know that, but I like to say that at the beginning of episodes so that people know that that's the case. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. If you want to listen, if you're, listening and you want to watch, I did put in a lot of work on this background and it looks really nice. I mean, I don't like to do my own horn. There's things that could be better about it. It's kind of like this Texans win that we just witnessed. It is a win, but maybe it could be a little better. And so if you want to watch, it's on YouTube. So just make sure that you look up The Bullpen, a Houston Texans podcast, and you will find us wherever you want to find us if you want to hear about the Texans. I'm going to put out more information about Locker. I've been pushing that a lot, and I finally got the chance to play it. I've been pretty open with the fact that I like the concept, but haven't been able to actually play it. And there's a lot to be said. I still think that it's a really good concept, but I think that maybe the way I've been explaining it might not be the way it needs to be explained, if you know what I mean. So be on the lookout for that. And if you want to do Texans live fantasy football, join the Bullpen League on Locker. All right, Tom. CJ, I feel like I'm going to lead with this question every week until it's just not obvious, or until it is obvious, I guess. But what are your feelings on CJ Stroud's performance? We'll start on the offensive side of the ball with that.
CJ made some amazing plays that only a handful of quarterbacks can make. CJ at times absolutely looked like the guy that most people feel is a top 5 quarterback in the league. But for me, in this particular game, I really felt like he held onto the ball a little bit too long. I think he had a little bit more faith in his offensive line than clearly they had in themselves, because they struggled mightily, whether it be penalty or just being able to hold blocks. And CJ had to make a lot happen with a little bit of time. And I think when he got into trouble, when he got sacked, or he didn't find his guy, it's because he probably was looking for a big play instead of taking some of the check down stuff that he had in front of him. I know there was a couple different times he probably checks down to Mixon, and we're talking about a more manageable situation than some of the 3rd and long situations he was in. And who knows what the score would have looked like had they been able to just methodically move their way down. I understand CJ's problem. He's got some fancy weapons that you want to use. You want to get the ball into those guys' hands. But I think that the Bears were just adamant that they weren't going to let Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell beat them. I think they were adamant they weren't going to let Nico Collins beat them, but Nico Collins proved that, he is a different animal.
Yeah, and I think that like one thing that needs to be addressed before talking about CJ Stroud's performance is the fact that the offense, more so than last week, was one-dimensional. And I think when you look at it through that lens, his performance is very comparable to last week. And I think that you could say it looked better, you could say it looked worse based on how you view it, through the lens that the Texans became very pass-first as the game went on. And that was, Joe Mixon, 9 rushes for 25 yards, was out for a good portion of the game with an injury due to the NFL declaring a rule exists that they don't want to enforce because I guess it's quite literally impossible. Joe Mixon, in case you don't follow him on Twitter, literally tweeted out after the game like, hey, if you're going to make a rule, if the NFL and NFLP are going to agree on this rule, they need to enforce it. And then when pressed about it from people in his replies, quoted someone and said, like, I literally went up to the ref after that play and was like, hey, that was by definition what the league has defined as a hip drop tackle. You need to call that. And the ref told him point blank, that was not a hip drop tackle. I don't see what you're talking about. So I think that that's going to be the case. I mean, these first 2 weeks, I think there's been plenty of hip drop tackle worthy plays that have not been called. And so that's just what you're going to have to deal with. I feel like the Texans in general, or I feel like most fans in general, J.J. Watt being a representative of the Texans, weren't really a fan of that rule anyways. So in my opinion, seeing it not enforced is not the worst thing, although I guess I don't like my own players getting injured because of it as the example. But looking at it, a one-dimensional offense is always going to set you up for kind of a tougher road. And so early on, CJ obviously, I think, made more of his impressive throws earlier in the game and had an easier go of it when there was a perceived threat of the run game. And as the game went on and the Bears realized that CJ was just going to throw it and that the run game was not going to be effective, that was when I think we saw the struggles from the passing game. But all in all, I mean, I feel like it's a developmental thing, and I think it's just pretty much the same old story, same old song and dance. If we're looking at what happened last week to this week, it's CJ doing what is relatively good considering how early it is. Like, we're talking about other teams that are like, yeah, our passing game's getting developed. And like, if we look at like the Titans, they're saying probably the same thing, but they're talking about a Will Levis that's thrown like 6 interceptions and 30 fumbles on plays that were like weird. They're talking about Will Levis like forcing the play, and it's like a weird backwards lateral fumble to the Jets. And we're talking about CJ Stroud maybe hanging on to the ball too long. Like, it's different. There's levels to this, and CJ's version of this is not bad. So I don't think we're having the same conversation that other fan bases are based off like how good CJ did. It was for all intents and purposes a good game. Now branching off of CJ's performance and looking at what it affects, we look at this weapon-filled Texans receiving core, and we hope down the line that we'll see the fruits of that come to, like, the first week. I could honestly say that every receiver in the receiving core in their own way had a good game. I can't quite say that about this receiving core this week. It's really the Nico show and other guys that had catches. How do you feel? We'll just start in general with the receiving room and how they did in this game.
I felt for Tank. Obviously, there's a play he's got to make in the middle of that game where he probably normally makes that, and then his day is totally looked at totally different because it was a big play, it was a shot play. And then, after that, I really felt like CJ struggled to find him. There was a couple times where it looked like, throws were just, and a lot of that had to do with pressure in his face. It was not like CJ had a great pocket to deal from all night long. When he did, like you spoke to, he was able to make plays happen. I think when he was flushed out, he also made some plays. But I think right now what we're seeing 2 weeks in is that when he's in a scramble drill, the guy he's looking for is Nico Collins. And in each one of those situations, when he's had to improvise on the run, he's found Nico for huge plays. And that's where, I think you're looking at Nico's stat line totally different without them. Stephon Diggs, I thought he had for what he had was a good game. I feel like it's really hard to measure Stephon Diggs when you think about what they're asking him to do as opposed to what they're asking Nico Collins to do. I think he's more of a possession guy. They're looking to him to be, kind of a security blanket. Some of the plays that he had were basically, kind of like the simple check down routes, nothing really deep advancing down the field. That's more Nico's realm. That's more Tank's realm. So from that aspect, it's hard to ask more from Stephon Diggs and what he's doing. I love the player that he's being, though, the captain, the teammate. Nico gets that touchdown. He goes right to him. They share that moment where, they're celebrating this touchdown. And if he was a bitter guy, if he was a diva like they made him out to be, then we're not talking about him, relishing in Nico's success.
Yeah, and to be fair with Stephon Diggs, I felt like he kind of filled the role that Tank Dell did in week 1, where like I was impressed with Tank's performance, but it was really just 1 or 2 catches, and it was situations where like CJ needed something and Tank did it, whereas this week it was Stephon. And last week Stephon, got 2 touchdowns, which kind of separated his performance. And so with just 1 touchdown to go around and it going to the Texans clear wide receiver 1. And to take a quick sidebar, myself and I can't for sure speak to Tom here, but I was very clear throughout this process, especially when the Texans signed Stephon Diggs, that Nico Collins was the wide receiver 1. There was people who are like, well, we don't need to talk. I said that 1A, 1B, 1C is a cop out, and people said, well, we don't really need to talk. We have 1A, 1B, 1C. We don't need to talk about how the depth chart shakes out and who's who. And I was like, aside from the fact that Nico is the prototypical build of an X1 wide receiver 1 outside guy, what he does, what he brings to the table is wide receiver 1. It screams it. And Stephon Diggs being on this team doesn't change that. So I just wanted to reiterate that for my own personal, I don't like saying I told you so, but I do really like saying I told you so sometimes. And it's also really early. So this is the perfect time to hit screen record right now. Go ahead and bring this up 5 weeks from now when Stephon Diggs is leading the team in receiving yards, because I know I will. I'm marking it right now.
I was like, a victory lap in week 2?
A victory lap in week 2. We have to give the listeners something to look back on. And, it's like those episodes where we both always agree with each other. It's like less interesting than when we have a different opinion, Oh,
so. I definitely don't agree with you. I'll be clear. I was the guy that was going, I don't think you can peg a wide receiver 1 just based on build and that sort of jazz, because you got teams all over this league that their wide receiver 1 is not 6'2", 200, 220, whatever he is. I can't even remember his measurables, but that lead the league. Tyreek Hill,
6'4".
Okay,
6'4".
There you go. So I know Cheetah is a totally different animal, and no one questions whether or not he's wide receiver 1.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. But I think that so far, and if you could peg a wide receiver 1 based off 2 games, then like Noah Brown at a point last season would be the Texans wide receiver 1. And I don't think there's ever a point that Noah Brown was the Texans wide receiver 1. So I'm just taking an early victory lap. I may be a little overzealous. I may be getting ahead of myself. I'm going to acknowledge that, but I'm going to stick by it. I'm going to stick to my guns. That's where I'm at right now. But looking at the performance of this Texans wide receiver room, if we look at target share, I think it falls in line with the way that I've always viewed this wide receiver room. Nico Collins, 10 targets, Stephon Diggs, 6, Tank Dell, 4. The only person who out-targeted Tank Dell was Joe Mixon, who fell in at 5. That was always kind of how I saw it shaking out. And so it just on the production side of things, this week particularly, I think that watching what Tank Dell did, the theme that's going to come up, especially when we talk about the defense, is that the difference is one play. The difference is one play. And that'll become more apparent when we actually talk about the defense, how that theme transfers. But that's what I'm going to say right now with Tank. And then with Diggs, it just feels like consistently like you said, his role and what they're asking him to do, just, he'll get his target share, but he'd really have to do something with it. He'd have to like that screen they ran on 3rd and 17. I'm like, he would have had to have been the one to do something with that. They weren't setting him up. They weren't throwing him a deep ball and saying, here you go, here's your shot at jackpot. They were like, here's a little play here. Maybe you can do something with it. And so with that, when you put it through that lens, I'm not disappointed with the wide receiver performance in this one. It's hard to be when the Texans win the game. But if there's one wide receiver I was a little bit disappointed in, at least it's Tank. But he only had one or two plays that were really like, if he made that, it's a very different game for him. And so I mean, and like the theme of this discussion is, it's hard to make a decision on the whole season over 2 games, as much as I'm going to do that with Tank Dell or with Nico Collins, being the wide receiver 1. But that's just kind of where I'm at. I want to give you a second to respond to what I said, because I feel like you probably have something to say to it before we move into the next topic.
I thought, I don't know if you saw, I'm sure you did because you follow him, but Houston Stressens did a really good job sharing the John Gruden podcast, where he broke down the Texans and how he spoke to what the Texans are trying to do to teams. And it was interesting because exactly what Gruden said is exactly what the Texans did tonight. They stacked 3 wide receivers on one side, leaving Nico Collins on an island, one-on-one with a wide receiver, with a corner, I'm sorry. And I feel like that's advantage Nico Collins. But I will say this as well. If they put anybody over there by themselves 1v1, I feel it's advantage Texans. So while Nico has the ability to, moss or be able to have a bigger size advantage on certain corners, I do believe that Diggs' route running or Tank's speed and quickness could also get them open just as well. And we could be talking 2 weeks from now where, like you said, it could be Diggs that's leading the league, or it could be Tank. It's really interesting to see that Bobby Slowick is committed to Nico Collins. Will he stay that way is really going to determine if your victory lap holds water, or if he's like, okay, weeks 3 through 6, Diggs, it's your turn to eat. And then we're looking at it totally different.
Yeah. And like you said, I mean, where they putting Nico, those are catches that I believe Tank or Stephon could make. Would they make them specifically in those situations? We'll never know. They weren't put in that spot, but I believe that if they were, personally at least, that they'd have a high likelihood of succeeding. But I mean, Nico is the one getting those plays right now. So that's all we have to go on. And so I'd say the reason I say 5 weeks from now is I'd say week 7, week 8, middle of the season is about the earliest point where you can say, okay, based off the trends and analysis that we have here, we can say that it holds true that insert this player is obviously CJ's favorite target, and then so on and so forth. But I will always hold, regardless of what the stats show, because I said this in the offseason, that the build of Nico Collins is wide receiver 1. He is prototypical outside, go deep, go get him wide receiver 1, regardless of what the stats show. But right now the stats show it too. So that's why I feel comfortable taking that victory lap, because then I'll cop out later in the season when people start calling me out on it and just say that he's a wide receiver 1 build. And now you guys have this here, so you can just call me out on it even harder. I'm just trying to load the gun for you guys for later in the season. So like I said, make sure you hit screen record. Make sure you get your phones ready so you can call me out on this later on. Just letting you know. Running back room. We briefly mentioned Joe Mixon and his target share. What do you think went wrong in the run game? Do you think the Bears played it better? Do you think the Texans, couldn't get it? I feel like, just for reference, the Colts gave up 160 yards rushing to us last week. They gave up, or just to Mixon, right? There was more rushing yards to be had. They gave up 160 approximately. I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but they gave up 160 yard rushing to the Packers in the first quarter of their game this past week. They had an awful day. Do you think maybe that the Colts run defense being awful played into setting our expectations a little too high for the run game? Or do you think there's a different source of this frustration?
So I do have those numbers. It was 215 yards total for the Texans last week, and 159 to, I'm struggling with the name
Nixon.
right now. Thank you. Anyway, I believe that the team just fell in love with the idea of letting CJ cook. While the Bears did have some early success, with the run game. I believe that the Bears gave up yardage in the run game the week prior. And that was something that I think if the Texans would have stayed firm to being balanced over time, I feel like it would have opened up. But I think in some instances where it's great to have all the toys, sometimes the right piece kind of eludes you because, oh, I could do this or I could do that, and you have too many options sometimes. And I feel like the Texans are incredibly fortunate to have so many options in ways that they can play football. But sometimes you have to be able to go, my best is better than your best, and I'm just going to commit to it. And I think the Texans did that with the Colts. And I think the Texans tried to shift gears a little bit with the Bears, and it made them a little predictable, in my opinion. Will they go back to the drawing board and have a better game plan for Minnesota next week? I absolutely think so.
Yeah, I have to believe so. I mean, and to speak to your point, like Bobby Slowick obviously caught a lot of flack on social media for the way things went down with running the offense. And to his credit, I mean, it is incredibly difficult to find when you have so many options to stick to one. And sometimes you get in your head and you're like, well, this is what I want to do, and I know I can do it. But is it the right call? Should I this, that, or the other? We could talk all day about the options that Bobby Slowick has, but I'd like to focus on the fact that I think that the point at which they might have decided to maybe diversify and give Joe Mixon a chance to kind of get back on the horse and ride and get the run game back into prominence was around the time that Joe Mixon ended up getting injured. And so then it felt like the Texans kind of had to scramble to see, do we really believe Cam Akers can bear the load? Dameon Pierce is also out. And so it felt like at that point, that's when they really said, okay, well, we're just going to pass now. And even so, it got to a point where they did try and give it to Akers, but that fumble in the red zone, I think, also kind of adversely affected their view of how they could use the run game. And it was around that time that Joe Mixon came back. He had been mixing in, to that point, and I think that they kind of regretted not having Mixon in on that play. I think it's a massive drag on Cam Akers' reputation on the roster, or where he stands as someone who probably won't be active if Dameon Pierce is active next week. I mean, I think that it could, if Dameon Pierce is close and says he can go, then they'll probably take him over Akers, maybe based off that, but I don't think they're looking too closely at that. D'Amico Ryans is a very, the past is the past. We got to look to now, who's our best player to do what we can do right now. So, but all in all, I think that with the cards that were dealt and the way that Joe Mixon injury played out, I think the Texans running back room put together a serviceable run. I think combined, they almost broke 100 yards. And there was times where it was serviceable enough that it seemed to kind of move the ball around. But I mean, there's no denying that this Texans offense was definitely one-dimensional. Do you think any of that blame sits with the offensive line? How did you think the offensive line held up with Juice Scruggs being out and just in general in the run in the pass game?
Well, the offensive line struggled mightily, in my opinion. I think this was probably a game that they're going to look back and go, we held the offense back. They were not opening up holes to run early on. I really feel for Cam Akers because he flashed what we all thought in the preseason he could be, which is a bona fide RB2. He had 7 carries for 32 yards, which breaks down to a 4.57 yard per carry. And you take that all day long, twice on Sunday. I feel like the Texans, had they have leaned into the run game over time, Mixon's, yards per carry probably get back to where they should be. They just didn't give him enough touches. When you go from 30 touches to 9, I mean, that's a big shift. And I think overall, you look at the offensive line and there were plays, there were penalties that really, stalled drives, and there were penalties that negated some big plays. So when you look at that, it just makes it really, really tough when the offense was constantly starting behind the sticks. And I think that's why the run game probably struggled too.
Yeah, no. Speaking of part of the run game, at least. Cade Stover got a lot of run at the fullback position, and this is the last position we really have to talk about before we move on to the defensive side of the ball. What did you think of Cade Stover's usage, and what did you think of the tight end room in general?
Cade Stover is going to be phenomenal for the Texans in like 2 years. Like, I can't say enough great things about Cade Stover. The ability to play fullback and to be, a serviceable passing option for CJ Stroud, like we saw on the 4th and 1. That's a rookie on a 4th and 1 on a national game. Prime time, first home game, everything, and he makes a phenomenal play. He blocked his tail off all day long. For a guy to play such a thankless role, fullback historically has always been that guy. You're just going to go out there and take punishment, and rarely are you going to get any kind of praise for it. Occasionally they'll throw you a bone, but then it's never really that big of a deal. I think Cade Stover is just a fantastic draft pick. I love the relationship he has with CJ Stroud, and I don't think this is the last time we see him do something to impact the game.
Yeah, and I'm kind of shocked because a lot of the talk coming out of Ohio State, like, he was literally asked at the combine, like, how have you worked to improve at run blocking? Because it's like not your strong suit. And or maybe it was pass blocking, maybe it was blocking in general, but they were not high on him as a blocker. And I'm watching him come down the pipeline, so before he had that 4th and 1, I'm watching him as a blocker. He's getting in there before and after that. Like, he had plays where I'm like, oh, Cade Stover made that run happen. Like, his ability to get in front and block was what made that happen. So I was shocked that people were so low on him as a blocker. And then looking at his ability to catch out of the backfield, I mean, all I'll say to that is that a lot of the talk this offseason when we traded for Ben Skoranek was how he could be a receiver who could fill that role. But with a tight end who can fill that role, like, you're adding your weapons and you're getting a guy who legitimately has the size. Like, Ben Skoranek, I don't know how much of a threat he would be as a blocker. He just I guess was enough of a threat that the Rams were comfortable putting him in there. But legit, I don't know if a team could guess what Cade Stover is going to do on a play at fullback. And that is the kind of threat that I am all about. So, and to speak to the tight end room, Brevin Jordan and Dalton Schultz had their fair share of catches. I think they were used in the way that a lot of tight end rooms are used in the league, just kind of small, pitch and catch stuff. Dalton had that one big one towards the end of the game that got down to the 5. And as someone who has him started in a couple of fantasy leagues due to a dire tight end situation in a couple of those leagues, I was kind of hoping for a touchdown there to help me out. And he did not give me that, but that's okay. We still love Dalton Schultz. Let's look at the defensive side of the ball. Okay, let's give it a shot. And I want to go straight into the secondary because this is where the theme of one play is the difference plays out. And I've spoken to this before when talking, about my favorite Texan, Jalen Petrie. And just, I had to make sure I said his name because, I'm going to say it again. He had a really good game, but the player I'm going to talk about right now when I speak to this one play is the difference is Derek Stingley. And that's to say that Derek Stingley, early on in the game, it felt like he was near every ball and he was definitely not in the right place for a lot of the game. It felt like he, as much as as a Texans fan, if you look at the Texans, you're like, yeah, Derek Stingley's locked down. I watched him play last year, and I know that if we had to pick a corner on this team, go one-on-one with anyone, Derek Stingley's the guy. It's always been, always will be. And so the whole first half, I was seeing it, and I was seeing it across social media. I was watching it myself, and I was like, man, it just feels like Derek Stingley cannot catch a break. And this is a quarterback that threw for 93 yards last week. And Derek Stingley just, what are you doing, man? Where are you at? And then all of a sudden, he gets that interception, and it's like, Derek Stingley, Sting, he's the guy. And so that's the theme. It felt like the whole secondary, the first half was like, man, they could be doing better in coverage. And then all of a sudden it became, oh, wow, a pick for Kamari Lassiter, and Derek Stingley's got a pick too. Do you think that's what played out? Because I feel like I'm telling a story based off how I saw it, which is that it felt like the secondary just kind of was meh, and then all of a sudden a couple plays happened and everyone was like, it's like being, a defensive end. If you get a sack or two, like the rest of the game, who cares what you did? You got your stat sheet, it's filled, people will love you, and you can now go and do your thing. So I mean, how did you feel about the secondary's performance in this game?
I'm so glad you brought it up the way you did, because I felt that way last week, and y'all were quick to. And I say y'all, you're not the only one that feels this way. Oh, it's the safeties. The corners are elite, and Stingley is lock, and Kamari the locksmith. Those guys are beyond reproach. And while I believe they are phenomenal, I believe they are very talented. Ball hawks will go up in high point of football. I think they are great. I think in coverage the last 2 weeks they have been beat a numerous amount of times that people want to kind of oh, this excuse or that excuse. And it's like, at some point, you need to say, Derek Stingley didn't make this tackle, or Derek Stingley got beat in coverage, and DJ Moore went out and made a play, or Kamari Lassiter got beat in coverage. And I'm not expecting them to be perfect. No one is. But if we're going to assign blame the way that you like to go after Jalen Petrie, or the way you used to, let me put it that way, the way you used to.
I'm a changed man. I'm a changed man.
Yes. You were convinced last year that Petrie was the bane of the Texans defense, and that if they could just fix him, they would be great. And now
that still plays true. To clarify, I believe the Texans have fixed him. That's the stage of this that we're at.
Well, then what are they going to do to fix Stingley and Kamari? Because minus those picks, we're talking about this totally different. Because DJ Moore should have been absolutely locked up. Odunze's in on one knee, and they got a bunch of guys that were like practice squad guys. And there should be no reason that Caleb Williams is completing passes to any of them. And they made Caleb Williams look not good, but way more respectable than he was before. For him to throw for 174 yards, I'm kind of like, where did the other? I truly believe that the Texans defense is 10 times what Tennessee's is, and he went for basically twice the yardage. That sounds wrong with the corners that we talked about, the edge rush that we talked about, which we'll get into. I just thought up until maybe the middle of the third quarter, the corners really did not have the best game. And I'm glad that you basically eloquently lined it out that once the stat sheet was filled, everybody's good. And that's what they're going to see. But I really feel like Stingley and not Petrie, I'm sorry, Kamari have to be very careful when the talent goes up, because they've had two quarterbacks that are not good quarterbacks to this point. Everybody feels like AR will get there one day. A lot of people feel like Caleb Williams will get there one day too. They're not there now. Caleb Williams went 23 for 37. That's a lot of misses. So I don't even have to get into AR or what AR did this past Sunday, because that was pretty bad too. So, but I think Sam Darnold, that's another step up. When we get to the elites, could be different.
And that's why I'm thankful that the schedule for the Texans shaped out the way it did. Obviously, with last week's performance, or this week's performance, I guess, by the Vikings, that game becomes a little more concerning. The Patriots, having ground out a couple of wins or at least close games, also brings a little more concern. But still, to this point, the first 6 weeks of the Texans season is the easiest stretch they'll probably face. And so getting these like ugly wins out of the way and learning from them and becoming better is important. To the point of the secondary's performance, I felt like last week it was less glaring, whatever errors were happening. There were and once again, last week I was more adamant about how the safety room was affecting the secondary's coverage. But this week it was a lot more readily apparent. A lot of it was on the outside. If it's deep, it's the corner. Even if it's not deep, more times than not, it's on the corner. And a lot of times, Stingley or Lassiter was in the area. More times Stingley than Lassiter, in my opinion. And so I think I'll chalk it up this time to a late start. I know that it looks like what happened is the secondary just wasn't there. And then the stat sheet got filled and now they were there. But I mean, it still rings true that the second half of the game, those stats are what I point to as like the turning points. But I did feel like the whole second half, the coverage was a lot better. So I'll chalk it up to a slow start and kind of move forward cautiously optimistic with where the secondary is at. As much as I should probably just drop the second word. I should just move forward cautiously. But I'm going to give them my optimism because it's 2 weeks, so I'm down to do that. And another factor that was supposed to affect that kind of transition into the next topic was the pass rush. And one of the things that stood out about this game is that statistically, so you said Caleb Williams threw the ball 37 times. On 36 of those pass attempts, he was under pressure. So that means that the pass rush was getting there every play except for one, and the coverage just kind of was. Obviously, I think it got better as the game got later and Caleb Williams got more beat up. I think that shows that the pass rush was effective in giving the corners what they needed, which was a Caleb Williams who was battered and scared and just desperately needed to have the ball out of his hands. And so that was helpful. But what did you make of the pass rush? 6 sacks, always under pressure, massive improvement from last week. What did you get out of it?
I mean, for me, it could have been like 10 sacks. You got to give some credit to Caleb Williams. He definitely Houdini'd out of 3 or 4 situations where Will Anderson had him dead to rights or Daniil Hunter had him dead to rights. So, but I mean, it was a different quarterback, right? So week 1, I kind of felt that AR was we were trying to keep him in the pocket. Week 2, I believe Caleb Williams was not about rushing, and that changed the way the Texans pressured him. So you saw guys trying to get home. You saw Daniil in the backfield. You saw Will Anderson in the backfield trying to get home. Mario Edwards. I mean, the whole defensive line did a really good job. The one thing I thought was really good was that there was really good pursuit. Like he would miss the first guy, second guy, third guy. Derek Barnett had a sack where it was like he was the third guy there, and they were able to finish off guys as opposed to seasons past where a mobile quarterback breaks out and now he's got a 10, 15-yard run. So this edge rush defense is really, really talented.
100%. I think I couldn't have said it better myself. There was the fact that there was only one of those plays where Caleb Williams really got out and really made the defense pay for missing him. Speaks to how good the pass rush was at not only getting after him, like it was a different pass rush than it was last week. They weren't just trying to contain him. They were hopefully get to him and take him out. And then when he did escape, from that initial pass rush, there was a good follow-up, a good follow-through on that. So I like the way the pass rush did. I think that if we're looking at the defensive line as a whole, that Mario Edwards is quickly shaping up to be the addition of the offseason, in my opinion. Obviously, on the lower key, we have to look at Daniil Hunter as being like the addition of the offseason, just from like who he is and his stature. But Mario Edwards is not someone who I expected to really contribute much to the Texans' defensive line, and he's already got, I think, like 2 or 3 sacks. Like he has been in the quarterback's face these first 2 weeks, and if that continues, I mean, it's going to be huge for this team, and it'll bring into question, not fully, right? Like obviously, Danico Autry has a place on this defensive line, but when you have a consistent pass rush from Fatukasi and Edwards, the situational and the rotational aspect of this interior defensive line is affected by how effective those guys have been. So the last group to cover on the defense is linebacker room. And I think the only story really worth talking about, I guess there's 2 from the linebacking room is, Henry To'oTo'o and Azeez Al-Shaair. There's other guys that played linebacker. Their presence wasn't quite made as well known as those 2 guys. We'll talk about To'oTo'o first. All over the field, literally, like very evident. He talked to how much weight he lost and how much quicker he feels, and it showed in this game. I felt like he was pretty active in previous games. I mean, I think that I don't know if I owe him an apology. I don't think I talked about it like he was not going to be a factor. I think I said my words were that I'd hope after spending a whole offseason with, D'Amico Ryans that you could get better at linebacker. And honestly, his biggest issue was being a liability in coverage, and I don't think that's fully healed, but I think they've just played schematically better to remove him from having to do that. So I'd say that To'oTo'o kind of fits in the category of Jalen Petrie. The Texans have moved him around in a way that makes him now a better player because he's not being put in situations where he has to do what he's not good at. So I don't think that counts as an apology. I'm not going to count it, but that is what I'll say for myself on To'oTo'o. But I want to hear what you have to say about To'oTo'o's performance.
I'm really, really happy for Henry To'oTo'o because there's a huge chunk of this fan base that was just totally basically out on him as a linebacker because he just could not be Blake Cashman, and that's what they wanted him to be. And the dude went and said, okay, first off, this is a second-year guy. I get it. The Texans, the bar is high, so everyone has to perform at a higher level. But these positions are not something you just walk in the door and, hey, I'm a stud now. So credit to Henry for going, okay, I need to change the way I play. He probably came in a little heavy thinking, all right, this is the kind of linebacker I need to be. Clearly in D'Amico's system, you need to be a speed guy. That's what wins in this system. So he lost a bunch of weight. Now he's incredibly fast. You see him flying all over the football field, making tackles all over the place because that's what this defense requires of him. And I thought it was foolish to feel like, oh, well, he can't be good. I thought D'Amico was going to take a young linebacker at some point in time and turn him into what he needed. And Henry To'oTo'o has become that guy. I think when Christian Harris gets back, this linebacker room is going to be absolutely fantastic. And I'm not going to victory lap it or anything like that, but I'm glad that I was in his corner, and now he's showing that he can be the guy that they went out and drafted.
Yeah, and I guess the part where I feel the worst about, I don't want to say I feel bad about it because I still, to some extent, believe it. Like the Texans linebacker depth is not there, but I think that I feel better about not using high draft capital on a linebacker with the way that To'oTo'o has developed, because that to me was the deepest concern, was not having a starting caliber linebacker in the event that, say, what happened. Christian Harris went on IR. So having To'oTo'o be able to step up and be that guy has been incredible. And so I'm glad that he was able to step up and do that. I will say that. Azeez Al-Shaair had a day. I mean, it felt like he had a personal vendetta against Caleb Williams and was trying to get as close to out of bounds and hit him as possible. And then there was that one play where I feel like he might have, the refs, as much as they flagged the Texans, probably could have flagged the Texans a little bit more based like this. There was a lot of hits in this game that were reminiscent of a time in the NFL that, how people talk about The Office and they're like, oh, The Office couldn't be made today because like some of the jokes in this show just do not stand the test of time from a PC perspective. And so like for me, watching some of like that hit that Jalen Petrie delivered, they flagged it and pulled the flag. And I was like, they pulled the flag. Like I thought they should have. I didn't think they should have thrown the flag, but like knowing the way the NFL is, I fully expected it when that hit was delivered. And so with that, I kind of expected a flag on the unnecessary roughness for hitting Caleb Williams out of bounds, especially a quarterback, right? But watching that happen and then watching how he got up, punched a guy in the face with his helmet on, and then like acted. I think he thought the Bears bench was gonna like swarm him or something and just like beat him up or jump him for hitting their quarterback. And the Bears, I don't think have the fortitude and the soundness of their collective. Their culture is not there for that to be a thing. I don't think. But watching him go out and hit him like that and then come up swinging. I like the attitude. I like where it came from. I like the fire. I felt like it fired up the defense. What do you make of Azeez Al-Shaair's just day as a whole and the way that he was?
So I thought he had a good football game. I thought that other than the punch, you pull the punch away everything was fine. I did not think the hit was flaggable. I think the running back, or I think Caleb Williams, not the running back, but he was kind of a running back at that point. It was on the line, and it's like, all right, if I hold up and he truck sticks me, then I look bad, and then he's still going down the field. For him to take him out of bounds and make sure that wasn't going to happen, that's the risk that you play. Caleb Williams could have absolutely slid, and we're not talking about it. The fact that when he did get up, there was a mob to where he had nowhere to get up. I think the moment got the best of him, and he just went to swinging because there was too many people in his airspace. Now, he's a captain. Does he need to do that? Absolutely not. Is that something that the league could absolutely fine or suspend him for next week? Absolutely. I really hope that's not the case. I think the officiating did a poor job of getting in there to kind of break that up. They did not give Alshire room to get up. It was like, he was mobbed, so to speak, because Caleb Williams was at the bottom of that too. And I think that other than the punch, I have no issue with anything he did or anything or any of the level of intensity he played with. I thought he was very good, and they're going to need him going forward. So I really hope that, us talking about it, maybe a fine, and that's the end of it.
Yeah, and to fully clarify, right? Like when I talk about flaggable offense and like the expectation of a flag, I think that based off the way Caleb Williams ran the entire day, I think he was asking to be hit at every point. He was not. I think he slid like once, and from an early point in the game, Caleb Williams, I think, brought on, because there's that whole like Josh Allen fake slide thing, and like the way quarterbacks will run to try and get around being hit, while also like encouraging the defense to think that they should lay off. So I think that whole game, Caleb Williams set himself up to get hit the way he did. But just understanding the way that games have been officiated for the past 5 years, I'd say 5 to 6 years, I expected a flag on that play based off of how it played out. And so I was kind of shocked that there wasn't one. And I mean, I guess in theory, it would seem as though the refs maybe have felt bad for being so awful at flagging literally everything else. I mean, the Texans are not usually a heavily penalized team, and man, did they get a lot of penalties. But with that, I believe that's all. Do you have anything else to say before we kind of bring this thing to a close?
I'm really glad the Texans are 2-0. They did not play their best football game tonight, and I think they would agree to that. But wins in the league are hard. And to be able to say that your team is 2-0 and every other team in the division is 0-2, it's a really good feeling.
It is a beautiful feeling. 2-0, 2-game lead. I mean, the division is merely a step on the way to what the Texans are capable of doing this year. And an ugly win is better than a loss. I mean, obviously. And I think that it's an important progression, an important step along the way of the Texans developing into this team that we know they can be by the end of this season. So I feel good about it. I feel like we ran a little long on this one. We usually go 30 minutes. I think we've maybe this was a little long, but there was a lot to talk about. I mean, I felt like it was a good conversation. I thank y'all for tuning in. As always, I have been James Roy. And you can find me at James Roy NFL on Twitter and at N1 Texans Fan on Instagram. Tom is at Third Coast Tom on Twitter and at TC Tom1 on Instagram. If you want to find the Bullpen on Twitter and Instagram, it is at the Bullpen Cast. I think I'm going to change the YouTube handle to that. I haven't done it yet, but I'm pretty sure that's what I'm going to do just to make it easier, more succinct with the Bullpen's newfound social media presence. If you want to reach the Bullpen on social media through direct message, though, don't message the Twitter, just message the Instagram. That's the most likely you're going to get a response. But anyway, as always, thanks for tuning in, and stay classy, Houston, and vamos Texans. Thanks for tuning into The Bullpen, a Texans podcast. Please like, comment, subscribe, and follow along for more Texans talk from The Bullpen.